all about writing with Ben and Sara.
Welcome to All About Writing, the podcast that covers everything about the world of writing from the inside out. This is episode 15, part 3 of our series on getting started. I'm Sara, here with my co-host Ben, who is an award-winning best-selling author and ghostwriter, editor, and publisher.
And I'm Ben, here with my co-host Sara, who's an award-winning best-selling author, screenwriter, editor, and TED Talk presenter. And today we're talking about the big idea. And with us today, we're really, really happy to have, I don't even know how many descriptors I can come up with here, but world-famous, award-winning, multiple best-selling, super author, Steven Erikson. Steve, it's really, really happy. We're really happy to have you here today. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you for the invitation. I'm looking forward to this. Although I'm astonished to hear that you're at part 15 of getting started. Yeah, that's intriguing.
Yeah, no, fair enough. Episode 15, part 3 of Getting Started.
Okay.
Yeah, so I mean, what we talk about in the Getting Started series is when, as an author, you're getting started. You just want to become an author, or you're just working on a new book or a new project. How do you get the vague ideas in your head moving forward? And often when authors are thinking about writing a book, they have like a big idea in their head, like a big theme or a notion or something they want to explore. But it can be hard to get that, which can be a fascinating idea, and turn it into an actual book. And so, Steve, I know that you have a lot of big ideas in your writing, but they never sort of come across as, this is the big idea. They're always woven into an amazing story. So that's what we want to talk about today, is how do you take a big idea and actually turn it into a story, or bring it into a story. So from all of your many books, I'll just throw it out to you. Can you think of any ways that you approach that, different ways, different times that you had that challenge in front of you?
Yeah, although strangely, I don't think in terms of big ideas. And quite often, the big idea doesn't even arrive until I'm well along in the work. So to me, it's more of a culmination of small, really cool ideas, and then using the narrative to find a way to sew them all together, and hopefully, something larger than the sum of its parts comes from that. But I mean, there's no guarantee of these things. But so I tend not to sort of take way too many notes and fill up notebooks and all that kind of stuff. I've learned for myself anyways, and this is different for every writer. So I always take all this advice with a huge grain of salt. But my experience has been that if I take too many notes, I kind of suck the life out of it. And I need that element of spontaneity and that element of exploration. I mean, writing is all about you sitting with your keyboard and your laptop, and you're exploring. And you can explore characters, you can explore settings, and there's a lot of sort of discovery that happens along the way. And quite often, the big idea is generated from those discoveries. And my sense is to simply trust the process. That makes sense?
Yeah, it can be a very organic process. It could be that the big idea is buried deep in there, but as you explore different ideas, it comes forth. Now, I know you're most famous for your fantasy novels, the Malazan Book of the Fallen, and everything based in that world. But you also have written some science fiction books, which I think are just as good, and they definitely deserve a wider readership than they've had. There's one book in particular which I'm familiar with, as you know, which is a book called Rejoice, A Knife to the Heart. Now, in that one, if I may, I would argue that you did start with a big idea and went from there. So can you walk me through how you came up with that one?
Um, well, I guess this would be the case for especially beginning writers. Something is haunting them, and it can take years before you're actually finally ready to approach it. Um, and with a beginning writer, that there can be a lot of sort of impatience to sort of get to the core of these things. Um, and for myself, I've learned that I can't force it at all. Rejoice was sitting in my head for at least 10 years, if not longer. And I also knew that I required a lot of research. And I was going to have to go down some pretty curious rabbit holes to do so. And so it was more a question then of, I had a sense of assembling everything I needed to tell this story, then I would sit down and finally start writing it. So yeah, I don't know if there are shortcuts. I really don't know if there are. And I had to read, it's a first contact novel, so I had to read virtually every first contact science fiction novel I could get my hands on. Although ironically, one of the finest of the first contact novels that I read when I was a teenager. So you know, it's had that an impact that's lasted all this time. And so finally, it was just I felt ready to start exploring that idea.
Do you think though that, whether it's the idea or a character or a mini plot arc or something like that, I mean, we are trying to talk to a lot of beginning writers there's not, I guess, chime in, is there such when someone talks about a big idea, does it have to be a plot? Does it have to be a character? Does it have to be a theme? Or are all of those fair game? Because I think hearing from someone who's, written in multiple genres and stuff, what is there anything, or do we give people permission to do whatever it is that is speaking to them?
Anything is fair game. Absolutely. Whatever sort of fires your imagination. And yeah, it can be a character, or it can be even an image of a character walking out of a scene or walking, into a scene can be enough. I think what one can look for if you're thinking you've got, you're juggling, you've got all these, you got a notebook and you've written down all these big ideas. The one that actually stirs the emotion as you consider it, I think would be certainly one way to highlight and underline that particular big idea. Because, as we know in terms of plotting, big ideas are in a sense a dime a dozen. So in terms of plot, there's only so much we can do. So you want something that has an emotional context for you as the writer, because that's where you can roll up your sleeves and start wading into that and exploring that idea. So I tend to look for something with resonance, and so it can just be an image or a single scene, or quite often for me, the end of the book is what comes first. Final scenes, and then I have to backtrack and figure out, okay, well, how can I bring the reader to that point where the emotion I'm feeling when I'm thinking about that scene can be conveyed across to that reader. And that's where you have to start building the building blocks of your plot, your characters, your stories. Everything else then has a requirement that is all in service to that final scene or that final moment, the climactic element, or it could even be a denouement. It doesn't have to be structurally, it doesn't have to be the climax. It can be something else. It can be what follows the climax. So my sense, I guess, is just whatever grabs your whatever stirs your soul is the thing to really look for.
Thank you. And something you said in there, about you can only do so much with plot, is that maybe something that we can put a little earmark and say, the big idea, if you've got a notebook or you think you have an idea for a book, is not really going to be a plot. It is going to be, like you said, an image, an idea, a character, because plot never really drives emotion. It's everything else that does. So a big idea is never a plot, right? Would we, or very rarely or something?
Oh, I agree. Absolutely. The plot, in narrative structure, plot it's a scaffolding. That's all it is. It's just it's the bones of your story. But what you're doing is you're wrapping muscle and you're wrapping tissue around that through characterization, through setting, through the motivations of the characters, which is what's going to drive the progress of the story. And through conflict, obviously, because you've got motivations of multiple characters and you'll get conflict. It's inevitable. So yeah, those are the things, much more so than plot. I actually don't really think about plot much anymore. It's not something that at least these days is of massive interest to me. I'm more interested in kind of subtextual stuff and just the lives of characters, the lives of people, and attempting to bring across some verisimilitude, even though it's a fantasy novel or a science fiction novel. And so then it's an exercise of stepping into their shoes or wearing their skin or whatever, and just inhabiting that space. And the story will build itself around that, usually.
Mm-hmm. I think it's fascinating, just coming back to a point that you made right at the start, which I think is really important for new authors to hear, about how often you don't start with the big idea, but it emerges as it comes along. I think that very often, aspiring authors, they'll have read books that they love, and they'll see the big idea in that book, and they'll think, oh, wow, that was amazing. The author must have started with that. So it's a really interesting perspective to hear, from a master like you, Steve, that, well, maybe, but most of the time, no. Most of the time, you start with something else that inspires you, and it emerges as you write.
Yeah, I would say certainly what you read and what you liked, even things maybe you didn't like. But we're kind of human AIs. I mean, we steal everything, right? So, but what happens is you absorb this idea from a novel you've read from some author, and if your imagination is engaged by it, you begin twisting that idea and twisting it to make it your own. And that is a perfectly valid thing to do. So, you read, I don't know, some Dan Brown or something, and you want to take that idea and you just want to twist it. What you will produce will be quite distinct from anything you previously read from the Dan Brown book that inspired you. So, generally, inspiration is a good thing. I guess it can only sort of go awry if you begin to mimic the writing style or whatever, because quite often, especially beginner writers, you latch onto a writer and their style, and you explore it by attempting it, for yourself, which is great. But eventually, your own style is going to push itself to the fore. It's the combination of all these inspirations and all these other authors is going to create your style. So in terms of reading and like always read other stuff and read outside your genre and just read because it can be something as minimal as how did Virginia Woolf move this character from this room into that room? And you can use that in any genre, right? You pull it out and you figure out how she did it, and that's something you can now use.
Well, that's interesting to think about how we're inspired by what we first imitated. I know the first stories that I wrote were very heavily inspired by some Smurf storybooks that I had. So I think that helps explain my childish writing style. Is that I got it from the Smurfs. So that's good to know. That makes me feel better.
I feel like I've read a screenplay of yours that still had some Smurfish vibes to them.
Nice.
Yeah, I'm going to own it. I'm going to lean into that. Yeah.
But it wasn't Smurfs. They weren't blue. So you did exactly what Steven said you do. You tweak it. No, I also, I I want to expound a little bit more with you too, Steven. When, let's say you have what you consider to be a big idea, right? I'm a writer and I have this vision of this character or this scene or something that I feel inspired by. But I don't see it in my head, right? If I'm new, I don't know really how it's going to play out. I don't even know how to map it. What advice can we give, writers who think they have a big idea or what we're calling a big idea? What do they do next? What are the next steps? How do they make sure it's actually viable, that there's really a book there, especially if they've never written anything before?
Well, okay, I'll try it this way. A big idea is usually something you think that is going to culminate towards the end of the novel. Say you're writing or a short story, right? It's what everything is leading towards. And so you can look at that big idea and then start deconstructing it and saying, okay, well, what was necessary to get us to that point where this big idea can actually, where all the pieces now are fitting together and creates this moment. And so imagine you've sort of set that idea up and you've written down some notes on it, and this is where it is. Now you have to backtrack to your starting points for all your characters so that they're going to proceed through the story so that they all sort of meet in some fashion. They don't physically have to, like on the page, they don't have to meet, but they can thematically meet. They can, in terms of their emotional development, they can all meet for that big idea. And that can really be helpful in shaping your characters. If you can think of a character, I don't know, who grew up, the setting is rural Iowa, but the big idea is centered in Seattle. And now, so you've got, okay, how am I going to get this character from rural Iowa to Seattle to that idea? And then the other characters from San Francisco, how am I going to get that character over? And I'm trying to sort of give you a geographical metaphor for this, but I don't mean it geographically. It's a question then of, okay, I have to somehow guide these characters or follow these characters until they reach the place I want them to be for that big idea. Because if you don't do that groundwork, then that idea it sits by itself and it has no emotional resonance. It has nothing. It's just a notion, if you will. So I think the bigness of an idea is what all the characters and all the other aspects of narrative fiction bring to that idea.
Mm-hmm. Do you think it's possible to, you've just described having a big idea, sort of everything builds to it at the end. Can you instead open with a big idea?
Oh, yeah.
Like basically a what if?
I was going to ask that too. I was like, start
Absolutely.
there and then go backstory.
Absolutely. In fact, yeah, writing against sort of the conventions of the genre can be really, really helpful, really useful. I mean, the example, Ben, you would know would be my novel Gardens of the Moon, which is the first of the 10-book series. It almost opens with almost the biggest scene in the entire novel, which is a huge siege that occurs. Mm-hmm. And even structurally within that, I flash back. I do a little flashback that leads us up to it. And yeah, it's like dropping people in the deep end fairly quickly. And if you can pull it off, great. I mean, you may lose readers doing it, but yes, the big idea can be right at the beginning. And then what are the ramifications of that big idea? So the Rejoice First Contact novel, that is the big idea that begins the novel, which is an alien abduction and the arrival of aliens to this planet. That's the big idea. So now what is the rest of the story? Well, that rest of the story is the existential crisis that hits humanity with the knowledge that we are no longer the apex species.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Sure.
Yeah. Yeah, fascinating stuff.
So, and I was gonna kind of ask about that too, but also, I've heard in various, you go to writing workshops and conferences and stuff, and sometimes people say putting the big idea in the front as a shock and awe, and then working back is almost like a bait and switch.
Mhm.
Do you think that that is the case sometimes, never, or it's it only is only if certain things are in play? I mean, do you have any opinions about that?
Um, well, you're also in film and television, aren't you? You're writing
I am.
scripts and stuff. Yeah, so I'm assuming you watch a lot. I certainly do. And I know that these days, if a scene opens, that is sort of the climactic scene, and then you get the flashback 4 weeks earlier, something along those lines. I kind of roll my eyes because, I've seen it so often now. So that's one of the risks is if you're just doing it for almost gimmick purpose or shock and awe or anything along those lines, it's not enough anymore, I don't think.
Well, how do we know it? How would we tell a writer so I kind of coach a few authors here and there, and one has this very climactic scene that she was going to put towards the end where she has and we actually told her put it in the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
And she was like, but that's the climax, and she didn't want to do the bait and switch. But it was in a way we realized that and maybe this is I'm kind of talking myself up to answering the question and asking what you guys think. But if it serves a purpose for the whole book, maybe it makes sense to go in the beginning. And if it's done for shock and awe and shock and awe only, that's when the big idea is not meant to be in the front, or that's where that scene is not meant to be. You have to build to it. Maybe that's a good rule of thumb we can offer people.
I think so. I think yeah, these days in fact I've even seen, people advising, writers advising online, basically, the opening lines of your story or your novel have to have a hook. And that to me is just uh that's Hollywood talking. That's script writing talking. That's elevator pitch talk. It does not need to be the case in a novel. And so hard and fast rules like that, yeah, I would be a bit leery of following them.
Yeah,
Um,
unless it
because
serves the narrative purpose.
yeah, but it's there are no quick fixes. There are no formulas, right? Um, so it would depend, I guess, on the story. What's at stake in terms of that story? Is everything at stake played out in that opening scene, the big climactic, the climax of the thing? Or is the aftermath and the repercussions of that event, what is that where the story lies? Right? And if that's where the story lies, then yeah, absolutely have it at the beginning. And then we can follow all those ripples and those echoes and those dominoes toppling all the way through the rest of the story. Absolutely. But if the climactic aspect of that story, um, at the beginning of a work is where you want everybody to come back to, then you have to probably structurally go back in time for the rest of the novel to bring us back up to that point. And then you can kind of echo that scene or even revisit that scene, but from a different point of view, and suddenly everything changes. Right?
Because you have the backstory and now things that you thought in
Yeah.
the first scene. Yeah.
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 So suddenly everything that you saw makes sense, but in a very different way at the end of the book. And that can be really cool for sure.
Yeah. I've done well in the middle,
Yeah.
doesn't sag.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great advice. I mean, it's good too for authors to be aware of what's been done, because obviously we do read a lot. We do, oh, I love how so and so did that. And it's great to take techniques, but also to be aware, that technique's been done a lot lately, and to be aware that, what, maybe I should try something different and fresh. It's fine to fall back on tried and true formulas with your writing, but always we should be aspiring to keep it fresh and make it our own. So it's a good thing to think about.
Yeah, it is. I think it's helpful to at least be aware of the traditional works that are the sort of foundational works of whatever genre you have to be working in. Um,
Hmm.
because I mean, we see it on a regular basis. The beginning writer thinking that they've created something that's never been seen before, and
Yeah.
it gets published, it gets reviewed, and the first critic or first reviewer is saying, yeah, well, this is just basically this story,
Yeah.
modernized. Uh,
Yeah.
and that can
It
feel
reminds.
awful if that happens, right? So
Oh yeah, yeah.
yeah.
It reminds me of a sci-fi convention I was at just a couple of years ago, and there was an agent who was just talking to the audience about things that they expect and so on, and any advice that she could give. And she said, "Yeah, don't have a starship explode in the first scene." I have no I can't tell you how many times I've seen that lately. Like it was just, I guess it was a thing at the
Mm.
time, and everybody was doing it. And starships exploding in the first scene, it was so bad. It's like, do not do that. So I mean, that was of the time. It may be clear now. So if someone wants to have a starship explode in the first scene, maybe they can again. But a couple of years ago, it was just like, nope, instant rejection. So it
Wow.
is important to be aware of what's trending in your genre right now. What's been done a lot, and
Hmm.
maybe what's been overdone a bit. So it's interesting perspective.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I do think too, um, thematically, from a thematic big picture point of view too, that um more and more I don't want to get too political, but I do think like current events, because of how we're force-fed news and current events now nonstop with social media and everything like that. You have to be really careful, A, not to be too on the nose, but also be cognizant of when no one wants those big ideas right now. They'll be vintage in 5 years, but they're not today. And it's too fresh,
Mhm.
or it's not interesting enough, or no one wants to read it because they're seeing it 24/7. When we first when COVID happened, at first there was this weird push, at least in Hollywood, I know, where people were like, "Oh, we're gonna do pandemic movies," and everyone's like, "A, there's a couple that we're watching already that have been done. B, we're living it. We don't want to see it. We don't even want to read it." And so, but like like you see it a little bit, like it's kind of part of the pop culture, and it's only been like 4 years, and so it's referenced more, and I think that that's something to be aware of too. Like, you think you have an awesome idea on something that feels like it would be the perfect idea because it's current. Sometimes being aware of those undertones are important too when you're thinking about getting started. um
Yeah, yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, it can obsolete your work very quickly, right? Especially if it takes 3 years to write it.
Mhm.
Um, you know what I mean? It's so I tend to go once removed in terms of engagement with the real world. So what I'm writing is very much so, and to my mind, in dialogue with that world, but from in a very indirect fashion. So I'm not going to be pulling things directly, recognizably, um, into the story that I'm writing. Um, but it's there in the background, and
like
and
thematically, you're saying, or just in
I'd
the
say thematically, very much so, and almost the subject of the conversation is the present world that I'm living in and my engagement with it, and I create that sort of a kind of a dialogue with that through my writing, through the fiction, and uh, as long as I'm not too sort of on the nose, then what generally happens is that dialogue slips into a kind of a timelessness. There's a universal
Mhm.
um, human condition, which is actually now is being explored, even though you've got the specifics that have inspired you as the writer living in your world. Um, that has kind of dropped away as you start recognizing that everything we're seeing on a daily basis is something that has always existed in some fashion, in some form. It's part of that human condition. Um, and that kind of universalizes it, and that takes it out of uh, the present moment. Um, I'll see if I can give an example. So if you were to write about COVID, but you don't want to write about COVID and you want to set it somewhere else, um, the things that you could draw from your experience of COVID would be um, the sudden end to physical mobility. You cannot move from one city to another. You cannot cross the city. You cannot get on a plane. You cannot do all these things. So suddenly you are closed in and you are potentially isolated. And then you might think, well, the other side of that was I got much closer to my family, my friends, because we created a small bubble and that was that. Um, so now can I create a story where something has happened that has closed and fragmented our society and our culture to create these small islands of sanity, if you will, um, and then build a story around those things as whatever whatever your version of COVID is slowly dwindles away or becomes absorbed into the cultures and into society and into our sensibilities. That now those borders start crumbling again, and then we start getting interaction between elements that we hadn't seen before. And from that, I mean, you can build an entire story. So that story can be set on another planet. I mean, it can be with aliens. It doesn't matter. But what you're actually talking about is your experience in this world of having gone through the COVID lockdowns. But it's so removed from it, it's not pinning itself into a time period.
Mhm.
That makes perfect
I
sense.
think I think that's a great way to summarize the big idea. It very much can be based on our personal experiences, but
Should be.
if we can make it universal, then that's what makes it a big idea,
Yeah,
rather than just my idea. So that's great.
absolutely.
I have one last question for Steven on this,
Mhm.
on this particular subject. Um, what, if any, of all the books you've written, that when the idea came to you, whatever it was, a scene, a character, a moment, which one for you, or if you can pick one, maybe there's multiple, you went, oh, this is gonna be amazing. Like I've had books like that, a couple where I'm like, yeah, let's do it. Have you had those like kind of moments with any of them?
Yeah, I try to it's two things that are happening. I try to foster that for each present work I'm working on. I mean, it's the one, right? Because all the other ones are already done. So they're in the past. I don't have to think about them. But the one I'm working on now, in my mind, has to be the best thing I've ever worked on. But I also recognize through all these years that that's all bullshit. I mean, none of it's true, right? So so I've got that other side that recognizes that I can easily fool myself into thinking something is far greater than it is, and I remind myself of that just to sort of stay humble on this stuff and not go, because you can create a work like that and you can think, yeah, this is going to be the bestseller, and if it isn't, it is crushing. It is crushing. And that can be so discouraging for a beginning writer, thinking that, they're writing the next bestseller. My experience has been we can't predict what the next bestseller is. Publishers can't, editors can't, nobody can. That seems to be the only consistency in publishing is that nobody has a clue. Um, and quite often, the big thing that hits will then get people following on, and publishers and editors are saying, well, we want a book just like this one, like this one. And none of them do as well as that first one, right?
Yeah.
Because that one arrived at the right time, and everything else is a copy of some version of a copy. Um, so publishers don't have a handle on this either. And I guess, um, yeah, I'm not really thinking in terms of sales or bestsellers and all that stuff. Generally, if an idea latches onto me these days, I'm recognizing that, yeah, it's not going to have a huge audience. Um, it fascinates me, but that's about as far as it goes. But that's okay, right? One of the things a writer requires is a sense of faith that their audience is out there, that they are writing to someone. They're not writing just for themselves. If they were writing just for themselves, then every manuscript would go on the shelf in the closet and never see the light of day. So you have to accept the fact that you are attempting to engage in an audience and dialogue with that audience. And you may not have a sense of who they are, but that doesn't matter. Just have the faith that they're out there.
That's a perfect one. Thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, Steve, thanks so much for joining us today. We've really appreciated being able to have your wisdom on board, and we'll have to have you back another time for sure.
Sure. Anytime.
Well, that's our show for today, everyone. Please don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any of our chats, and do feel free to leave a review. It really does help us a lot.
Don't forget you can find Ben at bennettrcoles.com as well as on Facebook and Instagram.
And you can catch up with Sara at saradalman.com and on Instagram.
Thanks for joining us today. Please reach out if there are any topics you'd like us to cover, and we'll see you again when we next chat all about writing.
This has been All About Writing with Ben and Sara.